You're listening to Cheers Podcast, brought to you by Snoo Snack, the all-natural sleep remedy. Snoo Snacks are made with all-natural ingredients to help you get the best night's sleep the all-natural way. For more information, go to www.snoosnack.com. This week's guest is Mark Anderson. Mark is an author, a scholar, and college philosophy professor. This is Cheers Podcast.
All right, welcome on this week to the Cheers Podcast, Mark Anderson. Thanks for coming, man. Cheers. Yeah, I'm glad that you came on. And the first question I have for you today to kind of go ahead and get this kicked off is I didn't really learn anything about philosophy in school until I was 19 and I was in college. So just for the viewers, could you, if this is possible, give an explanation or explain philosophy in 30 seconds?
I can't.
You can't. If you took a shot at it, what would you say?
Well, I would say philosophy is, well, first of all, what is philosophy exactly is part of what I write a lot about. So it's something that I can't really put briefly. But if I had to put it briefly, I would say it's thinking about things like what is the nature of reality? Can the nature of reality be known? If so, how can it be known? And what is the nature of a good life for a human being? And many people would say it's thinking about those sorts of questions rationally.
And is philosophy somewhat of like a science?
That depends on who you're talking to. There's a camp of philosophy generally referred to as analytic philosophy, which does try to think in scientific terms. And it's influenced by the way science works, mathematics works, logic works. So some people would say philosophy aspires to think in a way that's similar to the way science operates.
Right, and I guess the real distinction is maybe whereas in science you can particularly measure something, in philosophy that's not possible? Or in some way maybe it is?
It depends. I mean, there's a branch of philosophy that's somewhat recent called experimental philosophy where they do try to measure certain things. But, yeah, in many instances, like I was just talking about, what is the nature of reality? Can it be known? If so, how can it be known? That's not generally the sort of thing that you can measure with instruments like they try to do in science.
Right. And is that why, as a philosopher, you write a lot? Because it does take a lot of context and explanations to kind of explain concepts and different things like that in philosophy. Is that why a lot of philosophers write?
Well, a lot of scientists write too. You just write about different things. And it depends on the type of philosopher, the type of philosophy you're doing. But most philosophy is either by way of, first thinking, but then by way of articles or books. But again, science does the same sort of thing. Maybe it's more article-based than book-based. But it's an intellectual discipline, and intellect is communicated in words. And if you're going to reach a broader audience, you're going to put those words in books or articles.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, and you're a professor at Belmont University, correct? What classes do you teach there, and what is your role there?
Well, I'm the chair of the philosophy department. I've been there since 2004. I've been the chair, I'm not sure exactly, but for 4 years maybe. And I teach introduction to philosophy classes. I teach ethics classes, which is basically an introductory level class. And then I teach upper level classes. I teach a survey of ancient philosophy that all majors and minors have to take. And then I teach upper-level classes generally in Plato and Nietzsche.
Okay. And when I was preparing to speak with you about this, I know that like my biggest goal as a podcaster is to have like the people who are viewing to learn something out of all the different podcasts. And so I spent a while on the internet just browsing, looking at different philosophers. I wanted to be able to have a conversation with you about different philosophers. And I realized that coming to this conversation, I really want to learn something from this as well. And so my question is, as a professor, as somebody who is, teaching and constantly learning about philosophy, what is a philosopher that most people have generally probably never heard of, but do you feel is important to the history of philosophy, and maybe tell us a little bit about them? Because, the Plato's, Nietzsche, all those are so easy to find out about. So maybe something that's less available but is also just as interesting.
Well, first, I don't think Plato's and Nietzsche's that easy to think about, especially for the general audience. Most people, especially with Nietzsche, people who aren't trained, officially studying philosophy, tend to think they know a little something about Nietzsche, and they're usually wildly mistaken about Nietzsche. But maybe, and we can maybe talk more about that, but maybe more obscure philosophers thinking about Plato and Nietzsche are some of what are called the pre-Socratic philosophers prior to Socrates. And two important names are Parmenides and Heraclitus. And again, I mention those because both of them are one way or another influential on Plato and Nietzsche, either by their accepting part of what they have to say or rejecting part of what they have to say. But Parmenides, and we're talking about roughly 500 BC for both of these, Parmenides had the view that all of reality is just one thing. And if we see multiplicity around us, like we do right here, there's hundreds of things around us right now.
Right.
That is, this technically probably not the best word, but that's something like an illusion. There really is no multiplicity. There's no movement. There's no change. There's no coming into being and passing out of being. There's just one eternally existing, unchanging thing. Parmenides.
Okay.
Heraclitus is kind of just the opposite. He thinks maybe there's only a multiplicity that's constantly changing, and nothing ever stays the same, even from fraction of a second to a fraction of a second. So maybe Parmenides and Heraclitus are two good examples.
Okay, and you said that they were before Socrates.
Yeah.
And just for reference, where does Socrates fall in relation to, let's say, a really popular one like Plato?
Well, Socrates is 470 to 399 BC, and Plato's 428 to 348. So Plato associated with Socrates maybe for the last 20 years or so, 15 years of Socrates' life. So they overlap.
Okay. So
Socrates is roughly 40 years older than Plato.
Okay. And just to reference, give me just a moment. Okay, so with that, I knew you have a good answer for that, so thank you for that. I want to know, and you made this statement, of course I brought up the ones that I feel like most people talk about are Plato or Nietzsche or different things like that, and why is it that those are so popular? And you also made the good point that some people really think they understand it and they don't. Do you know why those are kind of, I guess I would call the poster child for philosophy? Why are they in those positions? What did they do that is different than some of the others that we haven't heard of?
Well, I was about to say everybody's maybe heard of somebody like Descartes.
Okay.
People have heard, I think, therefore I am. A lot of people have heard that. That's from Descartes. So there's some major figures, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, major figures in particular time periods. So Plato and Aristotle, we're talking about ancient. Descartes, often called the father of modern philosophy, even though there are a couple of important philosophers just prior to him. And Nietzsche's been extraordinarily influential. So I think people have heard of Plato and Nietzsche in part because they're wildly influential, both in their time period and beyond. And Plato, some of Plato's texts are taught in college, sometimes not even just in philosophy classes, but general liberal arts classes. And sometimes, depending on where somebody goes to high school, they might have read a little Plato, because Plato's Apology, which is Plato's version of the speech that Socrates gave when he was on trial. He was put on trial for his life. He delivers a speech, which is some people take as an advocacy of freedom of thought and learning and the importance of learning. So all that's to say, Plato's taught a lot. So that's why some people have heard of him. Nietzsche's not taught that much in high school, say, or in your general introduction to philosophy class in college, but his name's very popular, especially these days with the rise of the new atheist movement and that sort of thing. So his name is kind of out there in popular culture, but generally it's a very superficial version of what he's really about that's out there in popular culture.
Just the part of him that people want to talk about, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting thing. So you think that what kind of catapulted their career forward was the fact that Plato was maybe into other things? Like you said, he wrote about Socrates, and that's kind of what put him on the map, I guess, is how I'm trying to understand that.
Well, Plato's important because he's just one of the greatest intellects and artists in the history of the West, period, not just in philosophy, but as a thinker, as a writer, as an artist. who writes creatively and intellectually, he's as important as anybody else in the West. So if you think of somebody like Michelangelo as an artist, or Galileo as a scientist, Plato's in those sorts of ranks. And from early on, though it's very controversial with other people who are competing with him for students and intellectual superiority of the times and all of that, but from very early on, he was recognized to be important because great.
Because he's great. Okay. Yeah, that. See, I don't read into it as much, so that's a really interesting point that you made, that he is just great, is why he's so well known. So that's good. I mean, I can appreciate that this science as well is also pushing people forward who are just the best at it. So I really like that. A question that I had for you is, so right now I feel like, and probably every generation thinks this, but so many things are, to me, feel very chaotic, and especially our society and just the world in general, with, military things going on and shootings at school and just so many crazy things going on. Being in philosophy, I'm sure you've also seen a lot of history as well, because going along with these philosophies are the history of the times that they were in. Can you compare this time period we're in right now to anyone in the past? And if you can, what came of that time period? Was it resolved? Did it get worse? Do you see anything in the past that looks like where we are now? Of course, I know there isn't technology and stuff like that, but just anything in general, how society is. Was it like that at any point in the past?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I'm not a historian, first of all.
Yeah.
And though I do study ancient Greece in particular, including the history, but one of the popular parallels to make with our period is the end of the Roman Empire. But the similarity there supposedly is the decadence of institutions, political institutions, what there was under an empire, declined. The nobility of the period, given that it was under the rule of an emperor, and there wasn't a lot of active political possibilities since the emperor dominated the political scene. So the nobility didn't really have a political outlet for their higher aspirations. They collapsed into kind of materialism, just the desire for possessions and pleasure, etc. And the disparity between the rich and the poor was extreme and grew wider. And so if there's similarities like that to our own political situation, and to the disparities between the rich and the poor, people make those comparisons. I'm not sure how useful they are.
Yeah.
It wasn't a democracy as we are, so if you take into account what our political situation is, it's very hard to make a comparison to some periods in the past because our political life is so radically different. So I really don't know if they're useful analogies, this little section here compared to this section of some other time period, or this little bit in our society compared to some other society, little bit in their society. But generally speaking, I'm not sure how much you can learn that way.
Yeah, I guess I get what you're coming from that, where some things are similar, but in a grand scheme of things, it is completely different. So I guess it is hard to compare. And I made this point earlier when we were talking originally about some of the philosophers, that I didn't learn hardly anything about philosophy until I was 19. Super interested in it, but I feel like if I had gotten into it earlier, I read some things that philosophy can help develop: critical thinking. I mean, even the power of controlling your own emotions, different things like that. So do you, as a philosopher, agree that it should be taught at maybe a younger age, maybe, elementary school? I don't know. Do you think that would be beneficial, or is it something that can wait till college?
No, it probably would be beneficial to teach it earlier. And various people write about this, about trying to strategize about introducing philosophy into high school or even earlier. So, and it happens in some places, but it's definitely not standard. So it can be good. Whether or not it helps improve critical thinking, or people who are inclined toward critical thinking are drawn to philosophy, is a bit of a controversy within philosophy. Because, for example, philosophy majors score very well on law school entrance exams. So in colleges, sometimes people market, their major, you should study philosophy because it'll help you with the law school entrance exams.
Yeah.
Well, will philosophy actually help you with the law school entrance exams, or are the people whose minds are already kind of situated in such a way that they'll do well on those exams are drawn to philosophy. Right?
That's a good
So does
question.
philosophy do something, or is it just help develop people who are already inclined in that direction? So it can make you better. It can exercise your reading and thinking skills, and the earlier you can do that, the better. But what exact payoff it could have for just your average student is hard to determine.
Yeah, that's tricky because it goes back to the whole there's no numbers thing. So, but I believe in it. I thought it was great, the classes that I had. So it really helped me out. Have you heard about the, I think it's the University of Wisconsin is moving forward with removing some majors from their school, and one of them is philosophy. That's just a university. So that's what kind of prompted me to ask that question about, do you think it should be taught even earlier? Because I feel like because when you're in college, you get to choose what you get to elect and study in. So I thought that was weird that a university is getting rid of an entire major. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that happens a lot, especially in state schools where the government's put pressure and on the sort of majors that people are offered. In these days, science, technology, engineering, and math are thought to be the great majors to take because those are the ones that give you practical job skills. So this is just part of the recent decline of the university in general. I mean, I also study classics, Greek and Latin, Greek history, Roman history. Those majors are maybe the first to go in universities. When they're paring down their majors, they'll get rid of classics because they think who needs Greek and Latin these days. And the next to go are fields like philosophy or sociology or literature. Again, because they're thinking, really, we just need to be teaching people technological skills that they can get a payoff for when they're seeking a job. But as I say, that's part of a broader movement, which I think is the destruction of the universities and turning them just into job training centers as opposed to training people in the liberal arts, training their minds, their souls, their hearts, however you want to put it, in the literature and the art of the West. That is seen as somehow frivolous because it doesn't pay off financially.
Well, you can't measure that it can, but I bet that being a better thinker probably does pay off down the line. So I agree with you on that. But I mean, that's a really good point. So you see that, or you believe that there's a decline in the university standard, basically.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and you think that's nationwide or is that worldwide?
It's definitely nationwide. Worldwide, I guess there are trends in that direction in various places, but I know less about the university structures in other countries, but it's definitely nationwide. The movement away from literature and art and toward just what is perceived to be job training.
Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that our political system, or not political, but economic system is capitalism, which is the accumulation of goods? You do better when you do that. So if you go to a university, the goal is to get more money, and just on paper, from what we know, you make more money by going into math, science, different things like that. Do you think that it has something to do with just the entire structure of our country?
Maybe, but I mean, we were a capitalist nation 50, 60 years ago and things weren't like that. So you could be a capitalist nation, but with an understanding among the citizenry that there's more to life than financial advancement and material goods. And capitalism has to do with the structure of the economy, but it doesn't have to do necessarily with what people prioritize as good in life. So I think it's less capitalism than a change of what we prioritize as good. And people want job security, and they're not thinking through whether having job security in the way they're trying for it now, which is focusing in college just on what looks like will have a payoff in a job, whether having that sort of so-called job security is actually going to be good for a person's whole life.
And I love that point. Like that makes so much sense. But what do you see as possibly maybe a first step in moving in the right direction to creating value for not just making money, just going to university to get your degree? Is there a logical first step? Is it teaching it younger? Do you see a first step to that?
It's not an easy first step. I mean, I talk about this with my classes at the beginning of the year about what's happened to the university. And I cite some articles where they quote employers who are complaining now that people who graduate with a bachelor's degree, they know the technological skills that are required for the particular job, but they lack writing skills, they lack speaking skills, they can't think originally or creatively, they don't know how to think in general. And as more and more employers realize that these college graduates don't actually, on average, turn out to be great workers, then my hope anyway is they'll eventually realize, well, I can save a lot of money by hiring somebody without a college degree. So I'm going to hire somebody without a college degree because the people with a college degree aren't particularly special. And if that more and more of that starts to happen, then the word will go out. You actually don't need a college degree to get a job. Right now, everybody is in college, whether they like to learn or not. Most of them don't like to learn. They're in college just because their parents and society tells them you have to go to college to get a job. That's what's debased college. They're not there because they want to learn. They just want to get their diploma so they can get the job. If the word eventually goes out, and this will take a long time, that college degrees not really going to get you a job because, as I say, the employers are recognizing people with college degrees aren't that great, then maybe gradually fewer people will go to college, and maybe college can return to being about learning as opposed to just training for a job. I don't know that's going to happen completely because people make a lot of money off the way colleges work these days, the people involved in the universities. So I think they're going to resist that. They're going to do everything they can to keep more and more people at college because the tuition is lucrative.
Yes.
And they can raise the tuition prices. So the people who have a financial stake in the way colleges operate now are going to resist their decline. Yeah.
Since I've graduated and just being around, obviously different people from time to time, I can't help but notice that I feel different, but I understand now that I've went to college that you do not need a college degree to be in a certain place or to be a certain way. So I like that point a lot because that makes total sense. And I see that cycle that you're referring to where people are just going to college now because society says that they need it. But if at some point employers decide to start hiring people and realizing I can just train them to do what I would like them to do, and they're just the same as somebody with a college degree because people with a college degree are not actually bringing that many valuable skills. So then in the college system, then back to the fundamentals. Is that kind of the full cycle point that you're making?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure I was on the right track because I really like that point because I feel that since graduating college that it's not that different than everybody else I'm around that doesn't have a degree. So I think that the college system could definitely use some adjustments because you're right. It's very lucrative. It almost feels like a money system, but that's a whole nother topic. So what we're going to go ahead and do, we're going to jump to a quick break and we'll be right back. So catch us on the other side.
If you'd like to be a sponsor for Cheers Podcast or see your advertisement here, please contact us at thecheerspodcast@gmail.com or find us on social media at thecheerspod on Instagram.
All right, welcome back. So I want to talk about what we're drinking, what we're eating today. Since we're doing philosophy, I wanted to take it back a few thousand years. I read that philosophers drink wine, eat bread, and eat cheese. So we have our spread today, so I wanted to fancy it up a little bit for the philosophy conversation. Mark is a philosopher and also a writer, and he brought some of his books along with him today. If you just want to give us a quick description of some of these books. I know you've written, what is it? Is that 5?
5.
6? 5. 5 different books, all on philosophy. And if you just want to kind of take us through some of those books.
Well, the first one's called Pure, Modernity, Philosophy, and the One. The title Pure is a reference to an idea in Plato, purification.
Okay.
This is kind of original philosophy from a Platonic perspective with a little bit of anti-Nietzsche thrown in, which I no longer subscribe exactly to this position. So this is kind of a pro-Platonic, anti-Nietzschean book.
So let me stop you real quick. Did you say in this book there are some concepts in there that you actually don't stand by anymore? Is that?
Oh yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, this is very much. I mean, there's a whole chapter in here that's dedicated to a critique of Nietzsche, whereas the position that I adopt these days is quite a bit different.
Interesting.
From this. Even at the time, I mean, I kind of talk about this in the preface. Even at the time, I wasn't really opposed to Nietzsche, but I was adopting that position for particular purposes in my own thinking and
Mm-hmm.
life.
So you preference that. You said, hey, this is an idea, but kind of preference it though it might change.
No, but in the preface, I talk about how this is the book is written as a kind of intellectual cure.
Uh-huh.
And it doesn't say in there that my thoughts will or even might change. But I think the preface implies that this isn't, I'm not necessarily committed to these beliefs, certainly not committed to them forever.
Yes.
But like all my books, running through this book are both Plato and Nietzsche. I guess really, in a way, all my books have Plato and Nietzsche in them.
Uh-huh.
Whereas in this one, Nietzsche is kind of cast as the villain, whereas that's not true in any of the other books.
Okay. I get that. And are these, the way you're bringing these out, are these in chronological
Yeah.
order?
Yeah.
Chronological. There we go.
So
What
there's
we got
another
next?
one then, which I don't have here because it exists only as an ebook,
Okay.
which is kind of a fictionalized autobiography. And it started to be a follow-up to this. And as I was writing it, I was realizing I really don't think like this anymore. And I wanted to try to write something a little more creative. So anyway, in experimenting with styles, experimenting with content, I wrote a semi-fictionalized book about a professor.
Mm-hmm.
That professor had written a book kind of like this one
Okay.
and was writing a follow-up.
Okay.
But was,
Sounds familiar.
But was realizing his thoughts had changed.
Huh.
So it's about that professor and the changing of his thoughts, and there's some kind of psychological undertones running through the whole book. Anyway, that's called The Thinker Artist, and that book exists only as an ebook.
Okay.
And it took me a few years to write that because I was experimenting with changing styles, moving closer to the style that I write in today.
Yeah.
And I finished that and put it out as an ebook right about the same time this book came out, Plato and Nietzsche, which is a more straight academic book published by Bloomsbury. It's an introduction to Plato and Nietzsche. It's written for, say, undergraduates who are working through it with a professor,
Yeah.
or graduate students on their own who maybe know about Plato but not Nietzsche, or who know about Nietzsche but not Plato, and really who I had in mind when I was writing it to say somebody with a college degree who likes to read, like you were saying earlier, maybe, or maybe before we started, I forget. People know about Plato and Nietzsche.
Yes.
So people who write, people who think they might know about Plato and Nietzsche, they've read a little here and there, but they don't actually know them. So this was written for the literate, intelligent layperson to learn more about Plato and Nietzsche, but it's introduction to their thought.
Okay.
Then the year after that is this book, Moby Dick is Philosophy, which is, it's a lot of things, but its structure is a chapter-by-chapter commentary on Moby Dick. But Plato and Nietzsche are woven through that chapter-by-chapter commentary, in part because Melville himself was influenced by Plato, was influenced in particular by a particular dialogue by Plato called the Phaedo, which I do a lot of work on. And he actually read the Phaedo right before he started working on Moby Dick. There's some references to Plato throughout Moby Dick. And he lived, he was older than Nietzsche. He never read Nietzsche, but he has a lot of, I think, ideas that anticipate Nietzsche's work. So it's a chapter-by-chapter commentary on Moby Dick, but woven through there are Plato and Nietzsche and kind of the whole history of philosophy. And so it's about Melville and his Platonic and Nietzschean intellectual tendencies in relation to Moby Dick.
And can you talk to me a little bit about that cover? Where'd you come up with that, and what is that?
So the cover is, there's a guy who did online every day, he did a new drawing or painting based on a page of Moby Dick. And I can't remember how I came across that, but I saw his artwork. His name's Matt Kish. Saw his artwork and really liked it, and contacted him and asked if I could use one of his pieces for the book. And he just had a painting of one of these here, and I really liked it. And I decided to put 3 in the cover. It's kind of an allusion to Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return, which maybe we can talk more about later. but time, roughly speaking, moving in a circle and events repeating themselves over and over again. So I liked the painting in general, but the circle there kind of tied in with the theme of eternal return. And then Matt Kish did a painting specifically for the cover that I used on the back here. So yeah, it's a painter whose work you can see online, but who has a lot of great images inspired by Moby Dick.
Yeah, I knew you'd have a good explanation for that, so thanks.
Yeah, sure.
I've been wondering.
Then after that is this book, Zarathustra Stone, which is a mostly factual account of the day that Nietzsche had this insight into the idea I just referred to, the eternal return.
Mm-hmm.
Nietzsche in 1881 came to this insight that time repeats itself, the history of the universe repeats itself, everybody's individual life, all the events in the universe, including our individual lives, repeat themselves infinitely without any changes. So we've had this conversation an infinite number of times already.
Sweet.
And we'll have it again an infinite number of times with no possibility of changing anything. And for Nietzsche, he seems to have thought that this was the most important idea of his life. And so this is written in the style of a work of fiction. But the character, who I only name twice in the book, I usually just refer to him as the professor. But the character is Nietzsche. I refer to him as Nietzsche twice in the book. But it begins with him waking up on the morning that he had this insight, and it ends with him having the insight in the afternoon. And then along the way, I give various accounts of his biographical background and his intellectual background in an attempt to explain what was behind his coming to that thought of the eternal return that day. And he famously had that thought, he describes this, next to a big rock, which is not in this picture.
Okay.
But the big rock is on this lake right here.
So that is the lake.
This is the lake, and the rock is about over here off the picture. And he later called that rock the Zarathustra Stone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the title is from.
I kind of like that the rock isn't on the front of the book, because it's like you need to go into the book to find the rock.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
I like that.
Okay. And then my most recent book that came out in January is Thinking Life, a philosophical fiction. This, too, is very much about Plato and Nietzsche and Plato's work, which I referenced earlier, the Phaedo, and in particular Nietzsche's book, The Gay Science, which he wrote while he was writing notes for it while he had this insight into the eternal return. And this is a fictional account about a philosopher who's an academic, who's a scholar, but who's unhappy with the conventional academic philosophical life and is striving to lead a more creative, free-spirited philosophical life, and who is helped along on that path by meeting a character who is clearly based on Nietzsche. It's not presented as Nietzsche, isn't Nietzsche in the book, but is very much, and it's meant to be noticed by people who understand Nietzsche, is very much influenced by Nietzsche. So, again, like all of the books, it's kind of a Plato-Nietzsche book. Mm-hmm. And again, like all of the books, a theme running through all of these books is what exactly is philosophy? What's the proper practice of philosophy with reference to Plato and Nietzsche?
So if we want to answer that question from the beginning of the podcast, we need to read all that.
Exactly, yeah.
So
because
that's why you were unable to answer it up front. I understand.
Because the idea is, I mean, for example, in Moby Dick is Philosophy, the way I conceive the relation between philosophy and wisdom, the way I describe philosophical types, is different than the way in my most recent book I do. So my thoughts about these things are similar, but the details have changed. So, yeah, the real answer to that question kind of gradually occurs if you're reading all of these books in chronological order.
Is there a real answer to that question, though? Because I see a process in these books where your thoughts are adjusting. Is there a point where you will understand this? Or is that the beauty in philosophy, is that you may not ever know exactly what your thought is?
Yeah, I think I probably won't. I think I'll develop this and change it. Again, there's similarities in what I'm thinking. I doubt I will think anything radically different, but I will change the focus or the stress. So, or I'll understand it more. I'll be able to connect it to other ideas, or I'll deepen it. So yeah, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And for me, probably the central philosophical question I ask is just that: what is the philosophical life? How does one live it? And am I living it? And so the books are constantly kind of a process of thinking through that question that will likely never end.
It's kind of cool. Yeah, that could be a good plot for a movie, maybe. So we've talked a lot about different philosophers and their philosophy, and obviously you're very well read on that. Is there a Mark Anderson philosophy? And if so, what is it?
No, I don't think there is. Well, to the extent that there is, maybe. It's, again, it has to do with Plato and Nietzsche. Plato and Nietzsche are in some ways radical opposites. Plato believes in, or Plato seems to believe in, that's another matter. Whether we really know what Plato thinks, what Plato believed, is a difficult question, and a question I write a lot about too. But let's just say for now, what Plato seems to believe in, or what the philosophy of Platonism that developed in the wake of Plato. So we might say Plato was not himself a Platonist, or we might wonder whether Plato was a Platonist. But Platonism that developed through Plato's works believes in a metaphysical reality, believes in eternal essences of things, eternal, unchanging essences of things that can be known through the proper exercise of the human intellect. And through knowing those essences of things, the human intellect can live the highest sort of life, and maybe after death separate from the human body and live some sort of blissful eternal afterlife, never being reborn again. By reborn again, I mean in some of Plato's dialogues, there's an idea of reincarnation. And maybe in the dialogue I've mentioned already, the Phaedo, there's an idea that the philosopher can die, separate the soul from the body, and never be reincarnated again, whereas most other people will be reincarnated. Well, Nietzsche rejects all of that. Nietzsche doesn't believe in anything metaphysical. Nietzsche doesn't believe in essences. Nietzsche doesn't believe in God. Nietzsche probably doesn't even believe in things like these books or me and you as physical objects. And Nietzsche doesn't really believe in reason as giving us access to the truth, which Plato did. So in some ways, Plato and Nietzsche are opposites. And so you'll find people who are Platonists or Nietzscheans, whereas I am maybe more both. So if you're talking about the Mark Anderson philosophy, it's maybe the attempt to hold these different views together in my mind at the same time. So I'm attracted to both Plato and Nietzsche without finally deciding, as I kind of appeared to do in this first book, right? The first book appears to say Plato's the answer, Nietzsche's wrong. All the other books are versions of saying actually they're both right or both worth participating in one's own intellect. So maybe that, I mean, it's an attempt to reconcile Plato and Nietzsche, which, again, most people would not do and would say is not possible. And maybe not reconcile them, but reconciling an individual mind with thinking through and with both of them, as opposed to privileging one over the other.
So you could say, in short, possibly that one of your goals is to make sense of something that, without being studied, really doesn't make any sense at all. Trying to bridge some gap that maybe isn't bridgeable at all to make sense of something that doesn't make sense.
Maybe, but I'm really, I think, just trying to make sense of myself and my own intellectual inclinations, which go in two different directions. I have intellectual inclinations, sympathies for the typical understanding of Platonism, but also Nietzsche. And instead of trying to decide who's right and who's wrong, I've realized that, first of all, maybe you can't even answer that question. But if you can answer that question, it's not as important as recognizing my own inclinations, which are toward both Plato and Nietzsche, and just becoming comfortable with that.
So in some way, like it seems as though your mission in life, I don't want to say it's the only thing you're going for, but something that's very important to you is something that you might not ever achieve. And in your philosophy, you're okay with that.
Oh, yeah.
You're okay with the study of trying to find this is fulfilling to you and is helping you describe yourself. So you're using philosophy to find your own philosophy, basically. Okay. And so I like that. And it seems like you're really into Plato and Nietzsche in particular. But I want to ask this, and you made the good point with your book about the stone. Can you say that word again?
Zarathustra.
Zarathustra's stone? Okay. And so that was an original idea that he had that day. It seems as though he owns that idea of things occurring on forever, basically. Are there any other areas in philosophy that have not been tapped yet, or maybe have just been tapped? Any interesting theories like a reality that keeps happening forever? Is there anything new that maybe I've never heard of or that my listeners might find interesting? Or maybe even a thought that you've had?
Yeah, I don't know. And first of all, that idea is not original to Nietzsche. Some of the ancients thought that too. So that a version, anyway, of that idea was around. And Nietzsche knew about it, but didn't believe it himself. And that day that I write about is the day that he did come to believe it himself. I don't know about ideas that people might not be familiar with. I mean, these days it seems like one of the major areas in philosophy is philosophy of mind, and trying to determine, a variety of things. Can consciousness be uploaded to a computer, that sort of thing?
Can it?
No, I think not.
Short answer.
But, people are working a lot on consciousness. And is consciousness, is the mind a thing, a substance that's distinct from the body? And if so, how do the two relate to one another? Or is the mind just a word for the activity of the brain? So as we're just starting to learn a lot of detailed information about the nature of the brain, right, as a physical object, that's really generating a lot of activity in the philosophy of mind. So that's a major field that's connected to developments in science that a lot of people are working on in philosophy today. But radical ideas like the eternal return, philosophy these days is very much a profession. Philosophy these days is very much about getting a job, securing a job, getting tenure, advancing one's reputation in the profession of philosophy.
Yeah.
And that tends to make wild, original ideas frowned on. People are doing little technical work, making small advances in some long-standing problem or argument. It's another reason why I'm drawn to Plato and Nietzsche, is because they're not just rigorous thinkers, let's say, but they're creative artists. So they're thinking about subjects that are traditionally in the field of philosophy, but they're thinking about them very much artistically, creatively. Whereas most of what's going on in the philosophy profession today doesn't have that creative, artistic element to it. So it's small, technical, logical details that people are working on, and that tends not to allow for the possibility of big new ideas.
So I know you said that big new ideas or something experimental is frowned upon. Do you yourself have any that maybe you would like to talk about?
No, because I'm thinking less about specific problems. Like, I don't have some grand insight into the nature of the mind, because that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about myself and my activity as a philosopher. Though I will say, since I'm talking about philosophy of mind, something that might be unknown and interesting to people listening to us is the thinking about, again, what consciousness is. There's this idea of panpsychism, which is all things are conscious to some extent, even particles down at the atomic level. Not that they're thinking about themselves, but that they have some kind of spark of consciousness, so that when you get wholes, broader collective wholes together, you start to get something like a mind. So panpsychism is the general term for it. Then you've got a sub-classification of that is micropsychism, again, which means even down at the particle level, something like consciousness exists. And then you've got cosmopsychism, which means the whole universe as a unit is a conscious entity. and all of us smaller parts of the universe are conscious because we are participating in that one grand consciousness. So that's a wild idea, but people are developing it because otherwise it's hard to know how consciousness comes to be. You've got physical matter like the brain. If you're not a panpsychist, then the components of that brain, the neurons, the molecules, the atoms, those things aren't conscious. This is just a physical object. How does a physical object become conscious? That's a problem that many people, anyway, don't see a way to resolve unless they say consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe in general, right?
So if our brain, as being a piece of matter, can be involved in consciousness, everything else must be, because our brain is just a part of all matter.
That's what some people want to argue.
Whoa, that's interesting. I've definitely never heard of that. Who's talking about that? Anybody in particular?
Well, maybe the most famous person is a guy named David Chalmers, who first introduced a version of this idea, but now more and more people are developing it in these kind of offshoots, like I say, micropsychism or cosmopsychism.
Yeah.
So there are lots of people working on it. Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. So glad I asked that question. And one of the last things that I wanted to talk to you about, I really wanted to know all the questions that I've asked so far, given great answers, so I appreciate that. Where can you find these books?
Everywhere. I mean, the easiest way is to order them through Amazon.
Amazon, and just search them by the name?
Yeah.
Okay. And so this is something that I thought a lot about in preparation for this interview. Is so many people, and I get this all the time, so many people are down on the generation known as the millennials. And so I got to thinking just about this generation and what it is compared to other generations. And I wanted to know, what do you see out of this generation that is so scrutinized? Is it normal for a younger generation to be scrutinized like the millennials have been? And do you see a particular philosophy from us, and is it a beneficial one?
I really don't know, because my experience with it is really just in the classroom, and it's hard to know. I mean, I assume they're quite different, but maybe not as different as the appearances are. So the majority, like I've already talked about, the majority of students I teach recently don't have an interest in reading and thinking and learning to write and learning. But that's probably always been true. But 50 years ago, there weren't so many of those students in a university. 50, 60 years ago, there would be a smaller percentage of college-age people in the university. So the majority of the people who were actually in the university were there because they wanted to learn. They wanted to read. They had probably a decent prior education. Whereas these days, a far greater percentage of the college-age population is in the university. So if you're sitting in a classroom looking at the students, there are many, many, many more people there who don't have any interest in being there for the sake of an education. So on the one hand, that's different. There are all these people in a college who don't care about what college has to offer, right? But as I say, there were probably that many people like that 50 years ago. They just weren't in college. I do believe probably that both the political class and the productive class, that by which I mean people producing things to sell, have developed their marketing skills to such an extent that it seems like these days, if I'm comparing it, say, to the generation that you read about or you watch about from the 60s, the generation these days seems more compliant. They care about what the people who are marketing to them, again, be they politicians or musicians or people selling clothes, they care about what those people tell them to care about. Now, those people have developed their marketing skills in such a way that they're not obviously telling them to care about these things, but they're doing. I mean, this is what advertising is, right? Care about this product.
Yeah.
And, of course, they've developed the technique of, say, incorporating even rebellion into their sales pitch, right? So now to be a rebel is itself just a kind of marketing ploy. So you've got a generation of people, many of them anyway, who are just going along with what the people in power want them to do, while at the same time thinking that they're not actually doing that they're somehow being original.
You nailed it. That makes a lot of sense when you put it out there like that. Is there a comparison like that anywhere in history? I know you're not a historian, but is there anything like that as far back as BC, different things like that that you've seen before?
Well, there's always been fads and fashion, but and what we're talking about now is partly that. But I don't know if it's ever been this extreme, in part because it took a very long time for marketers. So again, I'm talking about whether you're marketing a person as a politician, or a new style of music, or this year's clothing fashions. It took a long time for the marketers to really perfect their craft, and seems like they've perfected it in the past 10 or 20 years. So it's enabled them to rope more people into this than I assume was possible at any time in the past. So again, there's always been fads and fashion that the majority participates in, but it seems like maybe it's even more extreme now than it ever has been.
And is that a bad thing in your mind, or is that potentially lead somewhere good? We just don't know it yet.
Oh, I don't think it'll potentially lead anywhere good. I mean, you're crushing the individuality out of people and turning them into drones to labor for the already wealthy, right? And if they don't like it, then you market something else to them, like a pill or something, or some sort of wild, extreme indulgence in pleasure. So I don't see anything good coming out of it. Is it positively bad? I mean, in a sense, yes. I hesitate only because, again, throughout history, it's probably been a minority within the population that's engaged in great thinking, great art, great literature, great science, etc. That's always been a minority. So in that sense, maybe it's not that much different than it is now, by which I mean the majority of people seem to be spending time on the less important things. Probably always been that way. But the social disparities between the people who are being marketed to and the marketers who are profiting off of this, those social disparities are maybe much more extreme than they were. And then that can lead to unrest, that can lead to revolution, that can lead to despair. So in that sense, it's worse.
Don't want to end on a darker note, so I like that point though. That's some deep stuff right there. So appreciate you thinking through that one. Hopefully I can contain that one. So just here at the end of the podcast, answered a lot of questions, said a lot of things. I want to make sure that anything you want to talk about is said. So is there anything before we get off of here that you want to specifically talk about? Any philosophical statements you feel like people need to know?
Not really. I would just say if people are interested in these ideas, they need to seek out the books and read them. Going back to what I was saying before about whether philosophy can improve your critical thinking, or people who are already inclined to critical thinking are drawn to philosophy. There may be people watching us who were like me. When I was in high school, I didn't read anything. I had no intellectual life whatsoever. That didn't happen for me until years after high school. And so when I'm teaching, I imagine there's probably a couple students out there who are intellectual, but that intellect has never been nurtured. And sitting in this class, they might discover that they actually like this and resonate with it, and then I can encourage them to do more. So the same way, maybe there are people watching who maybe they've never had this kind of philosophical or intellectual life nurtured because of the society they grew up in, the family they grew up in, whatever. And if they hear something about it, read something about it, and it clicks with them, they need to pursue that. They need to look into that more, because all the forces, like we just talked about, are pushing them in the other direction. Because if too many people are thinking about this sort of thing, they won't be buying their silly new fashions every year. They won't be wasting their money on what's being marketed to them.
Yeah.
So there are lots of forces preventing people from reading this stuff, because otherwise we'll lose their money, right?
Correct.
So if you are one of these people and it kind of clicks with you, then I would just encourage them to look into it and try to read more about it.
Okay, and I agree with that. I think more people should pursue it. I would love to market your book to those people, but that is pretty complex material. How would you recommend that people first step? Back to the first step. What is a good first step in case somebody wants to see if philosophy piques their interest? Maybe a book, maybe a website, something.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there's a good podcast called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Starts at the traditional first philosopher and just goes through the whole history of philosophy. There's, there are bunches of podcasts, but I don't really know all of them.
There's this one.
There's this one. I'm talking about philosophical
Yeah,
ones.
yeah, right.
There's another one called The Unexamined Life, which is good. They talk about various books, and they're entertaining to hear them talk about. Sorry, The Partially Examined Life, not The Unexamined Life. Plato is classic, so you can get some of Plato's dialogues and read them and see if you're hooked. As I say, Nietzsche's very popular among people who aren't in the university, though it's very easy in that case to misread. So I guess I would say start with some Plato dialogues and read those and see if you're moved.
There you go.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
I had a great time. You can find this guy's books on Amazon. Just play back in the episode if you want to know the titles. I'll list them on the description of the video. And I know you're not on social media.
No.
Not on social media, so don't search him on Instagram or Twitter. You won't find him, but you will find this podcast. Mark, thank you so much for coming on. It was a great time, and thanks for talking to my viewers about some philosophy.
Thank you.
And then usually at the end we high five. I don't know if that's
Okay.
a philosophical thing, but
That's
we're going to
all
do
right.
it. Thanks, man.
If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram at Cheers Podcast. Be sure to comment what you'd like to hear from us in future episodes. Thanks for listening.